Snowshill, which I've only recently joined, so there's not much there yet. So if you do access it, please come and join me on there. But I'm not a bot, it's just I've just started my blue sky journey. So I was awarded my PhD in December through Northumbria University. And I currently work in the performing arts and education sectors. I previously served as an army officer. My thesis considered the concepts of neurodiversity, identity, connection, enchantment, and sensory interaction. And in terms of sensory interaction, not just the five privileged by the West, but also the vestibular, which is to do with movement and balance, proprioceptive, which is body awareness, and also interoceptive, which is internal and emotional sensing, and how those were part of my thesis will come out later on in today's seminar. So what I'm going to talk about today is linked to my doctoral studies and the research site, which I'll introduce a little bit more fully in just a few slides' time. But I'm going to be focusing on one specific feature, which is the gardens. And the title today is drawn from the notebooks that the site's creator bequeathed to everybody and his thoughts. And that was his thoughts on the purpose of a garden space as a place for man's rest and a children's fairyland. Now, a little bit of an admission before I start today is that before I did my research, I was a little bit dismissive of garden spaces. Now, to clarify, I love being outdoors and I find outdoors such an important place to be emotionally and physically for me. But specific to Snowshill, at the start of my research, it was the place I walked through to get to the manor house from the car park and the visitor centre. And my collaborators, so I'll just quickly explain that term. When I research, I'm an ethnographer, but I don't have research participants. I much prefer to work in a very flat, non-hierarchical term. So they were collaborators, so we worked together on their visits. So I was part of their visits as opposed to them being part of my research. So my collaborators kicked that notion into touch that the gardens and the walk to and from the car park and the visitor reception to the manor house were just that kind of a walk. And I realized that they were really important spaces, perhaps especially so to neurodivergent individuals. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'll introduce the site. I'll talk about my relationship with Snowshill. Charles Paget Wade, who's the last private owner, Wade and his perceptions of childhood and outdoors, the garden design and his intentions when he created the garden spaces. We'll look at some garden views and how the garden spaces became inspiration for the indoor spaces. We'll then look at some collaborator photos that they took on research journeys before we move to Wolf's Cove Model Village, which is a really special part of the site. And then I will offer some final thoughts to bring everything together. So, welcome to Snowshill Manor and Garden, National Trust property in Gloucestershire. It's right on the border of Gloucestershire and Worcestershire. And this was my doctoral site. Now, quick digital hands up if you've been there before. I can see Janet has been there before. Now, it's situated in a chocolate box Cotswold village, also called Snowshill. Any fans of Bridget Jones's Diary may actually recognise the village as the fictional village where her parents live. Annually, Snowshill, the National Trust site, receives around 85,000 visitors. And that's pretty extraordinary when you consider, first of all, the rural location, because you really need your own transport to get there, and the fact that it's only open for 8 months every year. So it's got quite a restricted opening period. Now, from this picture I provided there, it looks very much like your stereotypical English heritage site. And it's both exceptional and different from, but also typical of other heritage sites. Now, it's surrounded by countryside, both the village and the house, and the property consists of gardens, which are set out in an arts and crafts style, a manor house, which you can see before you, an annex called the priest's house, and an extensive collection of over 22,000 handmade objects that Charles Wade, the last private owner, amassed in his lifetime. And this collection dominates the site for most visitors. Now, like I said, it looks quite like a typical heritage site there until you get set foot into the doors. Now, it's really unfortunate today that I can't go into the collection in detail. It's really beyond the scope of what we want to talk about. And also the uniqueness of inside is quite hard to capture on a photo. But in a few slides' time, I'll share an image that hopefully just conveys that to you guys who might not have been before. Now, I've talked about the walk from the visitor reception to the main site, and this became a really important part of the research, and I've suggested this already. It was a warm-up for me and the collaborators. Quite often we didn't know each other at all, so it was a really good scene setting for us and get to know each other opportunity. I could introduce the site, we could open up to one another, and we could relax. And actually I've come across some really interesting research about the power of walking and research at the same time. And something that I wasn't really expecting was how important being in nature was for a lot of the collaborators. So just before I introduce you to the site in a bit more detail, I'll just introduce Snowshill and my relationship with the site. So I first visited Snowshill in the autumn of 2020 with my husband and children, which was the height of the COVID pandemic. And this is a picture of my children, who were still delightful and not teenagers at the time, in front of a piece called Granny's Cabinet. And this is a key part of the Snowshill collection. It was owned by Wade's maternal grandmother and was bequeathed to him upon her death. Now, to try and give you a bit more of a sense of the collection, this is Green Room, which is the home of the samurai. And I hope from this you get just a sense of how different Snowshill is from a lot of National Trust places. Now, before I just talk about the setting of this, I've specifically called this the home of the samurai collection, not the home of Wade. Wade didn't live in the house himself. He actually resided in the priest's house, the annex. The entire manor house was the home of his collection, not for a living person. Some lucky guests were allowed to stay there overnight, but otherwise it was the home to his 22,000 objects. Now, if you just look and try and absorb the atmosphere of this picture, and it very much exemplifies the unique way that Wade collected and then displayed his collection. The samurai feel alive. There's a sense of theatricality and performativity through the way he's positioned them, his use of light, shadow, and wall colour. Now, the wall colour I'll return to later on today. Now, typically, when we as a family go somewhere like a National Trust place, my daughter and I love the site. We love the stories behind it. My husband and son are a little bit more interested in where the cafe, the gift shop, and surviving the entire experience. This didn't happen at Snowshill. Now, I've already mentioned the fact that there's 22,000 objects there. What I haven't mentioned is that nearly every single object is unlabeled. So if you can just get a sense of what it's like to walk into a space that's full, it's carefully curated, so it's not like a hoarder's paradise, that's full of objects where you have to make your own meaning of everything. So my husband and son, from that day, I realised they were interacting with the collection through their curiosity and imagination, instead of just feeling as though they had to read every single information panel. They were asking questions of their own imagination, of the room guides. Now, this is something I consider in a lot more detail in my thesis, but there's not time to do that today. Suffice to say, however, that the reactions of my son and husband really piqued my interest, and this is something I decided I wanted to explore further, and hence Snowshill became the focus of my PhD. And because of their experience, I think, I presumed my research activities would really bring out the importance of the house and the collection, so I dismissed the impact of the outdoor spaces. Now, here's Charles Paget Wade, the creator of the site and the collection as it's known today. No, he himself was a man of contradictions and complexity. He was a businessman. He had sugarcane plantations and other business interests in St. Kitts. He was also an architect, a poet, a craftsperson, a reluctant First World War soldier, even though he loved military costumes and accessories, and a garden designer. The picture on the left is a photo taken from the National Trust collection, and the portrait on the right is it's a self-portrait that he did in around 1913, and that's him wearing one of his outfits from his collection. What he was also was a man of colour, and this is where it gets really complex, who inadvertently continued to benefit from the historic slave trade, and his family wealth was at least in part generated by financial reparations post the ending of the slave trade. It's really easy to label him as nothing other than an eccentric. That kind of stereotypical view that exists of an English gentleman who's got time on his hands and the wealth to indulge whatever wish he wants to. Yet it would be really disingenuous to do this. Yeah, he absolutely lived his life by his own rules. For example, he stopped being an architect because he was dismissive of the tastes and preferences of some of his clients. He thought he had better taste than them. He also eschewed modern living and preferred living in the past. So there was no electricity in the house in his lifetime. He made one concession in World War II. He decided to buy a wireless so he could keep up to date with what was happening in the war. And he dressed in clothes from the past. These pictures don't quite get it, but he would quite often dress up as a Civil War soldier or typically as an Edwardian gentleman, even when he went to St. Kitts. And he also had this adherence to arts and crafts principles. And ironically, for somebody who really treasured the past, these would make him very modern in some ways. His passion for recycling and reusing things. And I think some of the anecdotes that surround him perhaps do paint him in the light of an eccentric. So there's one time he bought a suit of armour at an auction, as you do in London, and he realised that it needed to be moved that day. So what he decided to do was to wear it home on the train that night, and he got arrested in Oxford Street for breach of the peace because not only was he then a suit of armour, but he was carrying a sword. So people have thought he's eccentric, but I think it's more likely that he himself was neurodivergent. I would guess ADHD, probably obsessive compulsive disorder. But I think this neurodiversity was needed to create the site. One thing I would really like to stress is, although my own personal opinion is that he was neurodivergent, I would never offer a formal diagnosis. Firstly, that's not my speciality, and secondly, he has never given permission for that to happen, and I think that's right to self-identify is really important. Now, although I keep talking about there's a lot of emphasis on the house and the contents, the garden was really important to Wade, and I think for him the gardens were a site of refuge as well as being key to the vision of the site. And I think when you read about his lifetime, he probably experienced adverse childhood experiences and also had post-traumatic stress disorder. I think possibly from being sent to boarding school and probably also from service in World War One. So just to look at the key strands of today's talk about the gardens being a place of man's rest and children's fairyland. And I think these bring together two really key tenets in Wade's practice in creating Snowshill. It's really easy to go to Snowshill and think it's a place of whimsy, but it wasn't. It was created with real careful consideration. Now, Wade didn't enjoy school. He thought the entire process was a little bit pointless. And he had really fond memories of his childhood until he sent away to school, firstly to live with Granny while he attended a day school, and then secondly for boarding school. But when you start to consider this whole thing of childhood and outdoors, so you really see the importance of imagination in the way that he named his spaces. So inside the house, you've got nadir, dragon, zenith, turquoise, mizzen, top gallant, 100 wheels, mermaid, and seventh heaven. And it's really interesting, I think, that seventh heaven is where the top of the building of the manor house, and it's where he kept his toys. He really put childhood on this pedestal. But like the manor house, the garden rooms are also theatrically designed with theatrical names to give the sense of curiosity and imagination. So in the garden, you've got spaces known as the Jolly Roger, our Millery Court, Sancta Maria Baia, and also Wolf's Cove, that model village that I've already mentioned. The photos on the slide that you can see that there really emphasize the last 2 points on the slide about the reverence of childhood, playfulness and curiosity, and also young visitors. So the toys on the right-hand side come from the room Seventh Heaven. And then on the left-hand side, it's a little niche, a little model that he's built that's mostly hidden in one of the rooms downstairs. And that Latin title of Res Obscurus Revelo is I Reveal Hidden Things. And he didn't just create this site to use his own imagination. That's how he wanted people to access the site, with a sense of playfulness and in curiosity too. So finally, we're at the garden rooms. So just as you look at this slide there, if you can just see that little red line on the top there, I'll just orientate you to that now. So when you think back to that earlier slide, when we were looking at the front of the manor house, that direction there, looking from right to left, is the front of the manor house there. Now, this plan gives a two-dimensional sense of the outdoor rooms that Wade had planned. You can see them all labelled very meticulously, and that's one of the plans that he designed himself or drew himself. Some of these features didn't come to fruition because he ran out of money, and also things like World War II happened. So he didn't just leave the site to the National Trust. He also left notebooks and nearly 100 boxes of papers, sketches and drawings. And it's through these that today's researchers in the National Trust know how important the outdoors were to him. And if you look at his architect's drawings, his sketches and watercolors, a lot of them are of outdoor spaces. They were really important to him. And when he served in World War I, he went around France. He served on the Western Front. He went around France and sketched and did a lot of watercolors of outdoor spaces. So it's not just the quote that I've given for the title of today's talk. One of the other things he said about gardens, and I think this is a really beautiful line, is that they're a place for pretty thoughts and soft musings. And I think you get that sense of a refuge through there. So I'll give you a quick whistle-top overview of the design and his original intent. So Wade designed the gardens alongside his friend and fellow architect, Mackay Hugh Bailey Scott. And they both had this vision and passion for integrated interiors and exteriors, so that outside spaces are an extension of inside and vice versa. So the arts and crafts really inspired the garden rooms. And this whole seamless blending from inside to out and vice versa even went as far as designing a special turquoise colour called Wade Blue, which we'll see in just a few slides' time. And that was actually really commented on by the collaborators. When he bought the property, the gardens were very much a blank canvas. And in his notebooks at the time, he said that the manor house was in the midst of a wilderness of chaos, but that this gave him a happy chance to create a garden of interest, to really let his imagination run wild. And to return to my original provocation, it was to be a place for man's rest and children's fairyland. And part of this for him was allowing nature to flourish in the space. It wasn't to be a place of artifice. It wasn't to be one of those gardens that look really pretty and everything within the borders. He wanted the finished spaces to fit in with the arts and crafts principles he cherished so much, so he reused materials. He used natural, local materials, local craftsmen and traditional methods. And it was these that my research collaborators have really connected with. He worked on the gardens himself, but he also employed others to help build it and then maintain the spaces. And Wade married later in life, and there's a lovely story about how he used to mow the lawn, and his wife Mary would stand at one end of the garden and give him a kiss every time he passed her by, like a reward for every lap that he'd done as he did the gardens. And I think this also demonstrates how the gardens for him and eventually for her were to be a place of solace and joy. So now let's head to the gardens. Sorry, I'm just grabbing a drink. I can feel my voice cracking. So quick introduction to my research activities first. So the collaborators were small family groups or individuals, and I would visit the site with them. I've already said that I'm an ethnographer in terms of research practice. I'm very much a messy ethnographer, so I don't go in with a plan that this is what will happen. And if this doesn't happen, the plan falls to pieces. Very much go with the flow. And what I was interested in were people's reactions to the various spaces, the connections and interactions they made with others, for example, the National Trust team and other visitors, and with this site, both specifically to specific areas or objects in the collection and more generally. So in terms of data I gathered, there were observations, and some of my observation notes ran to 4,000 words when I wrote the reports up afterwards. So that's a significant amount of data. Photographs, both mine and the collaborators. I gave them a plan as well, a room plan, and this is just for inside, and there's a myriad different reasons, which would probably be a good question why I didn't do this for garden as well. But they would come in with a plan, and they would stick emoticon stickers as to how they felt in each space. An activity sheet which was based on objects or just something that they really liked in the collection, so it could be indoors or outdoors, and a semi-structured post-visit conversation. All of the collaborators were neurodivergent. They didn't need to be diagnosed because a lot of people aren't looking for diagnosis now, firstly because it can take up to about 3 years for diagnosis to happen, and secondly, some people knowing that they are neurodivergent is enough. That's the level of support that they need. So when I originally designed my research, I was really interested in working with women who were diagnosed in adulthood with ADHD, but I decided that was too prescriptive. So the collaborators had a range of autism, dyslexia, and ADHD, different ages, genders, and a big span of conditions, and a lot of whom had co-occurring forms of neurodiversity, so autism with ADHD or OCD with dyslexia. And again, this comes back to me being a messy ethnographer. Life isn't neat. So I didn't want to limit the richness of my research experience. Now, from the photos that are on the screen just there, these were all taken by me. You can see that Wade designed the layout so that each outdoor room offered kind of an enticing vista that hints at something beyond. And I think you also get a sense of the softness and naturalness of the site that I've already mentioned. This isn't a place that's high maintenance or very artificial. So just to give you a little bit of a background on each picture, the main photo looks up to the manor house, so different angle from what you've seen before. The top right-hand picture, Wade added the pillar that's on the right-hand side so that the side of the house and that pillar framed a view of the hills. And again, you see that in the picture below, went through the view through the byre. So you don't just get a picture of the byre, so that's the Santa Maria byre, but you can also see straight through into the countryside beyond. The left-hand picture we'll come back to a little bit because it's something that really chimed with a couple of the collaborators. And that connects to the fairyland part, but I shall come back to that. Now, I've mentioned before that I hadn't placed much emphasis on gardens until the research activities began. Around the time that my research activity started, I read a book by a Japanese author called Higashida, who is a Japanese author. He has autism, but he's also non-verbal. and reading his book, which is called The Reason Why I Jump. So he wrote that as a young person looking back onto childhood. He subsequently wrote a second one as an adult looking back to being a young person, so a later teenager. So reading his book really prompted a reevaluation in my thoughts on the importance of outdoor spaces. He very much talks about light, water, and how water sounds and touches, and how being outdoors doesn't judge people with autism, they can be themselves. And I've talked about how the outdoors was important to Wade too, and there's this emotional connection that Higashida and Wade both demonstrated, where they connect emotionally to these outdoor spaces. Now, these are some of the views that my collaborators expressed as we went around. So I'm going to read these out verbatim. I have a real interest in creating a nice garden, and I like gardens on different levels, so that again, the second moment that you're going up steps and down steps and round corners into these different rooms, which are differently laid out. And I think you get a sense of that certainly from the top left and the top right hand picture. And that sense of movement and the interoception about how a space makes you feel and scaffolded comes out in that quote, and the proprioceptive sense about your internal emotional sensing about how you're going around different levels, and that's quite nice, and you feel very safe. And the collaborator who said this is somebody who likes her environment to be well ordered, and she continued that she liked Wade's division of the larger space into smaller garden rooms because this feature provided her with a sense of emotional security. And these are her exact words: "It's perhaps a bit more structured and organized rather than one general open space that I like in a different way, but you kind of feel safer when you're in those sort of smaller spaces." And I think that was a key factor to why my collaborators connected so much with Snowshill. Another person, another collaborator who really liked the garden space as well, said, "I really like the layout of the gardens." She was another adult, but that wasn't just restricted to the adults. So one of the younger collaborators said, "In the garden, I had more time and space to be able to enjoy what interested me." Interestingly, she was one of the collaborators who struggled to be inside the more crowded internal rooms. And I think her use of the word space is interesting. And again, hints at that interoceptive reaction and interoceptive value to the outdoor spaces. Now, the enjoyment of the gardens, I think, is also linked to a wider interest in the natural world. And another group of collaborators really connected to nature during their time at Snowshill. And I talked about the value of the walk from the car park and the visitor site to, or the visitor reception to the manor house. And one of the collaborators, it was a parent of, said that her children like being in nature. They have a love of wildlife and walking their dog. And then later on in the visit, one of the children said, bearing in mind at the time he was a 12-year-old, that gardening is one of his favourite hobbies, and how he now has pet canaries in an outdoor aviary. And that this was a recent birthday gift, and he talked about the pleasure he gets from just spending time with his birds. He just likes to sit in the aviary and be at one with his pets, because there's not that sense of judgment. And that prompted me back to another quote from Higashida, who talks about the joy of the natural world, and so that is how it helps him to forget that I'm a human being and that I'm one with special needs to boot. There's no sense of judgment. So back indoors for a second. So I've included these because it really brings home the importance of nature to Wade and this seamless blending of inside and outside. Just going to grab another quick swig of water. And also how these spaces, outdoors influences indoors and vice versa. So the mural on the left is from Witch's Garret, which is a room that isn't open to the public. It's really hidden away. It's beyond the top floor. And you can see there that it features mandrakes. And you see the sense of the connection between imagination, magic, and nature. And all of this that Wade kind of gathered in to use to create the site. And on the right-hand side, please ignore the people. If you look past them, you can see that this is the Wade blue colour, and that how this could be part of his vision of seamlessly blending inside and outside, because it's got that kind of sea green that's kind of the natural world, but also is inside, and it's used both inside in most of the rooms, but also in the garden spaces as well. So to the collaborators' photos, just give you a second just to have a look at those while I grab another quick drink. So I've said how collaborators, they all enjoyed the outdoor spaces. What I hadn't expected was how many of them would say that the outdoor spaces were their favourite part of the entire site. Now, these photos were all taken by the collaborators. They could either take photos themselves and send them to me, or I gave them an old mobile phone, and then I just downloaded them. So it's a range of groups who've taken these photos. Now, it wasn't just an overall sense that when we're having the post-visit chat and that people said, oh, we preferred the garden rooms. All of the research activities, so every single one of those different things I talked through came up with the same thing. And I think it was really linked to their sensory interactions. So the light qualities of the garden and fewer crowds there. So to do with the vision and interoceptive senses. And I think it's really easy to go, somebody's neurodivergent, they just don't like crowds. But I think there's also an important piece that they feel as though they can be more their authentic self in a space that's less crowded. So that's how it's to do with the interoceptive sense. It's not just there's fewer people around. The so what is more important in that they don't have to mask in the same way that they may feel pressured to do in a different space. They can enjoy and access that specific site or that specific place in a way that's authentically them. So I asked them to take pictures of whatever they wanted to do. So all of these were taken by collaborators with different forms of neurodiversity. So just a few themes that come out here, and the sense of colour, detail, water, touch and imagination all come out. So Wade had a known dislike for the snare and delusion of formal rose gardens. He chose flowering plants that added blues, mauves, and purple tones to the garden. And this is a direct quote from Wade, with only the sparing use of bright yellows and reds. And you can see that from the flower that's there. I'm not a garden expert. There's probably somebody there who's going to tell me exactly what that is and give me the Latin name as well. And this was shared by one collaborator who said that she specifically liked these gardens because of the colours that Wade had picked, and therefore the connection to nature that she likes and that she felt Wade had as well. So these are her words. The gardens I liked because the flowers on, she made popping noises and gestures, because I don't really like pink flowers. I don't like pink. The fact that the flowers were really wow colours, that was nice. And something else that came up, both indoors and outdoors, and you can get a sense of this from the photo, is look how the collaborators haven't taken a photo step back of a whole thing. Overall, they've tended to focus in on detail. And this was something else that really came up in my research, and this is something quite exciting, is how neurodivergent people will often look at the detail of an object, then step back and look at the overall piece, which is in direct antithesis to what neurotypical people do, which is take a general view of a room or a space or a thing and then hone in on a detail. There's also a recurring affinity to water on the leaves, on the flowers, and on the pond. And it's interesting, some collaborators really liked being around water. One collaborator, so you can see the water butt there on the left-hand side. Just for me, as a neurotypical person, the gentle tinkle of water into that was too much of a sensory overload noise to that person. So he loved the gardens. He found that sensorially difficult. Can you imagine what the noise inside the house was like for him, for other objects, for example, ticking clocks? Touch, there was a range in how people wanted to interact with the space through touch. Some people wanted to touch things, but there was also an aversion among other collaborators, which was partly to do with potential germs, but also the texture, how things feel. If you haven't got a reference point for how something feels, that's quite a big thing to do. Can't quite see a picture of them here. You can perhaps see it in the picture on the right-hand side, the main picture. Cobbles was sometimes quite challenging for one or two collaborators, how you transition from flat surface to a grass surface to cobblestones can be quite difficult. And then we also come to the that main picture there, what looks like a well. For one collaborator, wasn't a well, it was a giant's teacup. And we had a brilliant conversation about how Wade had created this giant's landscape, which is juxtaposed just behind that picture, which you can't see, is Wolf's Cove. So you've got the contrast of Wolf's Cove, a miniature village, a model village, with this giant's teacup, and how that is just transitioning from one feat of imagination to another. And as we talk about fairyland, I think this is a sense for how the collaborators really saw this as a place of imagination and a fairyland themselves. And that takes us very neatly to Wolf's Cove Model Village. Now, was this Wade's handcrafted fairyland, his real-life manifestation of a fairyland he wanted to create? Now, it's based on a model village. Well, sorry, it is a model village based on a fictional Cornish fishing village. And it prompted so many amazing conversations in my research about collaborators' love of miniature objects and also miniatures and models that they themselves had made. Now, again, and this is another mea culpa moment, before the research activities started, I'd kind of seen the model village as like a nice feature of the site, and I hadn't invested it with any deeper meaning or symbolism. But really quickly, after the research activities began, I came to realize that the theme of miniature objects was really important to collaborators, and that Wolf's Cove, along with other models, so there's lots of models and different things inside, how they really resonated with the audience, or with this audience of collaborators. Younger people and children who were among the collaborators, this held a real special allure and almost doll's house fascination for them, that spark of imagination. But it went beyond this too, and it actually prompted collaborators to share some really interesting vignettes from their past. Now, just as you look at the picture on the slide, on the left-hand side is the Sancta Maria Baia, which was Wade's summer bedroom, or he slept in the Jolly Roger, which was on the top floor, kind of like a mezzanine floor in Sancta Maria Baia, which is his summer bedroom. Must be nice to have a summer bedroom in your life. And what he would do every morning is he'd come out of his summer bedroom and go for a morning swim in the pond you can see just there in the picture. I can just see Katerina's face as she pulled there. I wouldn't be a fan of the pondweed myself either. But for me, and I think this really strikes at the heart of Wade, is that sense of Gulliver and a Lilliputian giant adventure and a giant dominating his space. And that really links neatly to themes of control and world making. So these 3 points are just off the right-hand side, so control, creativity, and rehearsal. That will come out as I just share these vignettes on this. And that for neurodivergent people, they live in a world that's set up for neurotypical people. It's a world over which they feel they have no control, sometimes very limited agency. And Wolf's Cove doesn't just showcase Wade's creativity, it also shows his level of crafting skill. So all of the objects that are there now have been either remade or restored by current volunteers at the site. But just look at that detail on the objects, not just in how they're created, but also in the other details that surround it. So at the back there, you can see the little bushes, which are, again, I'm not a gardener, which are cropped and pruned to look like they're trees. And that was the same in Wade's time. So he's purposefully picked plants that can be created so that they look like trees if you scale to the village. So not just a sense of control and creativity came out among the collaborators, but also the importance of models can play in helping to rehearse for real life situations. And a lot of the collaborators talked about how they would have a model that they would then use to manipulate it gives it the wrong sense, but they would use that as somewhere to rehearse for real life situations. So if you're neurodivergent, what better way of practicing for a children's birthday party or something than holding your own miniature birthday party at home so you can war game different scenarios? And this came out with one collaborator who said, as a child, she'd created a room in a little cupboard and it was a schoolroom. She talked passionately about when she was 8 years old that she'd made this doll's house schoolroom from paper and sellotape, but that this then became a rehearsal space. She became a teacher. And I think that's really interesting. And another collaborator talked about that she loved small toys when she was little, especially tiny persons' things, and that she would worry about them, and that she would worry they would fall into tiny cracks in the floor. One of the younger collaborators, in one of the children's in Grey Room, which I haven't shown you, it's one of the first floor rooms, that this little girl was mesmerised by Wade's miniature theatre. She can't believe that the tiny dolls are handmade by Wade, and that this fascination spread to the rest of her group, that everybody in the group became equally entranced by this small space and how it replicated a real life theatre. One collaborator talked in detail about Wolf's Cove, and it really chimed with her emotionally. And she said she used to make little worlds for the worry dolls she got in her Christmas stocking. And that she said that these little worry dolls weren't just a doll to her, they were an agency, and she felt like they came alive. She said that she would like to be able to live in one of the model houses she'd created, because for her they had immersive potential with real stories and characters. And this statement reminded me of The Borrowers, and I think it's really interesting that Mary Norton was inspired to write the series due to her own sensory experiences. So The Borrowers came about because as a child she had undiagnosed myopia, which meant that she used to really peer into hedgerows and into puddles instead of joining her brothers on kind of a bigger adventure. And that because she was peering into things, she started to imagine she was one of the small creatures who lived there, and that eventually as an adult, these became the borrower adventures. And this sensory world, the sensory world that we inhabit, shapes our other experiences, either inspires or limits our world as we try to make sense of different stimuli. And I think the collaborator's admission, where she used to make secret worlds with little figures, does that indicate a sense of shame that she identified with these small figures, or is she trying to keep them secret to protect them? So some final thoughts, and I've given you so much information, so thank you for bearing with me. There'll be at least one of you today who is thinking, are these findings that I've talked about, are they really just specific to neurodivergent people? And I think, no, they're probably not. And I think that neurodivergent people undoubtedly access places differently due to their sensory sensitivities and preferences. But I also think there are other groups out there who could also benefit from outdoor spaces like Snowshill. For example, people with mental ill health or people with dementia. I work with teenagers in a school setting, and I'm really aware of the challenges that are currently faced by children and young people post-COVID. Especially well-being. So I work a lot with this year's year 11, and they were year 6 when COVID hit. And it's really interesting about their lack of independence they have, but they're the group who didn't really walk to school in their last year of primary school by themselves. They didn't go to the park. And I think we're really seeing that now in the way that they struggle to navigate socially and emotionally with things. And I think part of it is that important thing of walking to school by yourself. And again, it's that importance of walking, experience spaces outside. And I think post-COVID, there has been, or indeed still needs to be, a general recalibration in our relationship with outdoors and nature. Because yes, it absolutely is a place for man's rest and a children's fairyland. And while these are really important, I think they've got so much more significance for so many other groups in so many other ways. So thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much. I'll stop sharing so we'll be able to see you, because we couldn't see anything. So thank you very much for a very interesting talk and a lot of thinking to do, I think, and it was quite thought-provoking. So I'll just check whether we have any thing in the chat. And if anyone's got any burning questions, if you can please raise your hand so we can sort of see you and answer questions. So
I've got a question.
Yes, Demelza, go for it.
Hello. Sorry, it says I left on the chat, but I didn't. I just moved from my office into the meeting room, so I'm here. Yeah, thank you. That was really, really interesting. I've been to Snowshill, and it is really a magical place, isn't it? Yeah, I'm doing a couple of pieces of work that sort of intersect with some of the things you've talked about in different ways. So some work looking at heritage sites and well-being, and also some work looking at nature connection and well-being. And I think something that comes across from both of those is that we're sort of learning more and more about that and those connections, but it always is sort of just further evidencing for groups who engage with those spaces. And you sort of started to touch on that a bit at the end. So we know a lot about people who visit heritage sites. It's good for their well-being, but it's quite a particular demographic who tend to engage with those spaces. So it's kind of, I guess, understanding what are the wider benefits and what are the access challenges. And I just, especially somewhere like Snowshill, that, as you said at the start, is quite inaccessible. I just want, it's not really a question, sorry, but just thoughts on that.
No, it's a really interesting thing, and I'd kind of presumed the same thing. So I had expected that a lot of the collaborators would go, I don't go to heritage sites because I find them really tricky. Actually, the opposite came up, and it was a question that I started off. So the kind of post-visit conversations, I had a loose list of questions, and if we veered off course, then that was fine. It wasn't, we had to do this. And actually what really came out was that they all really liked going to heritage places, and there was a few inhibiting things. Cost was one, time was another. But one of the family groups said that actually they make a point of going to heritage spaces because they are much more, it's easier for them to predict the day that they're going to have, and actually it's quieter for them, so that as a family they're more likely to have a nice experience than in other places. That kind of really threw me, because I thought the answer I'd get back on that kind of opening question was, we don't go to places, it's not for people like us. But actually it was spun around the other way, and it was other inhibiting factors. Among people, I would say under 30, it was almost certainly cost was the main thing. Other people, it was just the point they were with their family life. Something that I talk about in my thesis is, would people who didn't like heritage sites have volunteered to come and do the research? So repeating that with another group like you've talked about would be interesting, but then the level of support to potentially make them feel emotionally secure to engage, and that's a different question, a different challenge in itself. But I was really surprised that they all went, no, we love coming to heritage sites, they're very much other places for us, but these are the reasons why we don't.
Great, thank you. Anyone else with sort of questions for Fiona? Gallery, because then we can't see people. Okay. Do you have any questions, Andre, you would like to ask? No, sorry to put you on the
I
spot.
know it well, and
Yeah.
it's very interesting to see this different perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I
I just
ask you-
like,
sorry,
maybe
Yes.
there is a question actually.
Yeah.
Are you sharing some of this with the National Trust too, with the managers of the property?
Yeah. I've one of the things I've worked really hard to do is have good relationships across the board. You know, I talked about having collaborators, and I think relationships are so important. So Katie, who's the property manager, and I get together quite often. We did it originally over Zoom, but I try to get up there maybe about 4 to 6 times a year just for a general catch up. So I recently went and did a talk to their volunteers. So over the winter they do a volunteers winter talk series. So I went up and talked to their volunteers, and that went really well. I was really nervous about doing that because for people who volunteer at heritage sites are obviously really comfortable in heritage sites, and they sometimes expect that everybody will access a heritage site in the same way that they do. And I was a little bit worried that some of the stuff I talked about could be quite challenging for them. But actually, at the end, they said, you know, we came expecting to disagree with what you said, but it had the opposite effect. They said, you know, it's given us really good food for thought as to how we can best support all visitors. And that was really good to see, because I think it's really hard when you're passionate about something to not understand why some people might want to spend. So one of the collaborators in, if you know Snowshill, so the room you go in first, left hand side, turquoise, he spent, I think, nearly it was between 35 and 40 minutes in that one room. And for him, he said that where he has autism, and when he goes to a heritage site or to a museum, he always goes with friends and his partner who go through places much more quickly than he does. And he said it was brilliant to be able to give himself permission to be able to explore the site in the way that he wants to explore a site. So we were there nearly so long that we got kicked out at the end of the day. So that was really good to see, and you know, being able to share his experience compared to other people who perhaps found the indoor spaces more challenging and who wanted to be outside more. Being able to share that with the National Trust volunteers, I think, was really useful, and that there's no one size fits all on a visit experience, and it's having the confidence that I think they're all so passionate that if somebody doesn't want to be in a room for very long, you almost take it personally that you've done something wrong. And I think, you know, I think for volunteers, they're given their time. So I think it's really, and it was nice to give them the confidence that, you know, no, it's not a reflection on you. It's just, that's how that person wants to enjoy that space. And if they're there for 40 minutes or 2 minutes, then if they've got from that space, that's that object or that part of the building, then that's brilliant if they've enjoyed it, and that's all that matters.
Great, thank you. You want to have the last question?
Oh, it's actually a similar
Demelza?
question,
Yeah,
so it's okay.
yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Oh, Janet, go for it. Last question. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to comment. I think it's fascinating. I mean, I've been to Snowshill several times, and my son actually did some volunteering there when he was still at school. And I think it is such a very individual place. It has this kind of multi-layered character, doesn't it? That you can engage with the detail, or you can engage with the whole atmosphere, which is, you know, like you say, it has that kind of magical thing about it. And in some ways, therefore, I think, you know, it was a really rich choice for you as a site to be working with, because it has all those different dimensions. And I was thinking in my mind, you know, compared to some other National Trust properties that I've been to, you know, they don't have that same quality. And it would be really interesting to know if you were able to have a bit of the same work in a different location, whether you'd then be able to tease out how much of what you found was to do with the unique qualities of that particular space, or how much of it would be kind of generalizable lessons for the National Trust in thinking about visitor management. You know, I'm thinking about, for example, Chesterton, when it first opened, they had timed entries. So that would have been terrible for you, a neurodiverse person, because they'd have been, shunted through the rooms at pace in order to make sure that there was room for the next cohort that were coming. So, some of the things you found, if they were translatable beyond Snowshill, that would be very useful, I would think, to know about for visitor management and planning more generally.
I mean, I think one of the really interesting things, and this isn't gardens specific, this is almost certainly indoors, is that the lack of labelling really, really resonated. That I had expected it to be collaborators with dyslexia who would go, we really like the fact there's no reading because we can access it the same way. And that did come out. But what really came out was women with ADHD who also have OCD, because OCD and ADHD actually go together more closely than autism and OCD. And they said in other sites, they feel as though they haven't done the site unless they've read every single piece of information that's there. So actually, they don't enjoy the site because they're too busy reading the information. And they said having nothing to read means that they connect with the site and make their own meaning so that they enjoyed it. And I hadn't expected that to come through so powerfully for that group. And that was something really useful to share with the National Trust as more sites tried to have, standardized information paneling or perhaps share information in a similar way, to go, actually, this is what this group of people said. And for people with ADHD especially, the imagination was really important. So individuals with autism would quite often go, we really like indoors, but we don't love indoors, because for them especially, that was the group who really liked the detail of objects. So if it's a little bit dark, they can't access those details. Whereas individuals with ADHD went, well, this is marvelous because I've created a story about this and that, and I don't want any of this nonsense about actual information because that's stopping me from having fun and exploring it through the imagination. And for groups who came, so families who might have mixed forms of neurodiversity, that was really interesting because there was some brilliant conversations where in the group somebody would say it was a bit dark, and then somebody else went, no, we want none of this light nonsense. We like wage shadow and everything like that. So that was really interesting. That's been quite a good thing to share, to talk about differences, because everybody goes neurodivergent, they all want the same support, the same scaffolding, and that really came out as being the opposite.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Fiona. This was really thought-provoking and inspiring, and it was a really very different insight to a side that many of us know. So thank you very much. Really grateful for your talk, and thank you everyone else who joined us, and we'll see you at another CCRI seminar. So thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.